The white tent went dead silent the moment the Belgian Malinois sat down in front of the wedding cake and refused to move. Officer Derek Holt felt his stomach drop straight through the grass under his boots. Nicole Briggs stood at the edge of the aisle in her ivory dress, still holding her father's arm, watching a stranger's dog stare at her 5-tier gardenia cake as if there were a heart beating somewhere inside it. Before we go any further, drop a comment telling me what part of the world you are listening from right now, and hit that subscribe button so stories like this one keep finding you. 14 months. That was how long Nicole had spent choosing the color of the linen napkins, tasting 3 kinds of buttercream, arguing with her mother about whether the guest list really needed her cousin from Toledo, and losing that argument the way she always lost arguments with her mother. Millbrook Farm sat at the end of a slow curve on Route 48 outside Dayton, Ohio, and on any other Saturday in June, it looked like the cover of a magazine. Fields of soft green. A red barn kept just weathered enough to feel honest. A crooked apple tree at the far edge of the grass where somebody had hung a wooden swing back in 1970-something and never taken it down. She had told Travis the first time she saw the place that she wanted to get married under that apple tree. He had laughed and said she was the only bride in the country who would trade a cathedral for a barn. She had told him she wanted this day to feel like her, not like a photograph of somebody else's day. He had promised her that everything about it would be exactly hers. He had promised her a lot of things. The string quartet was 3 notes into the first bar of the processional when Officer Derek Holt pulled his cruiser onto the gravel service lane behind the caterer's truck. Dispatch had flagged the call 20 minutes earlier. An anonymous tip. A male voice. No callback number. The voice had said, and he could still hear it because the desk sergeant had played the audio for him twice over the radio, that there were narcotics being moved through a private event at the Millbrook Farm address. Derek had rolled his eyes when the sergeant read it out. 9 times out of 10, an anonymous tip on a Saturday afternoon was a jealous ex or a drunk neighbor with a grudge. He had figured he would do a slow walkthrough, keep his radio low, and be back on the county road before anybody said a single vow. Ranger had other plans. The Belgian Malinois had been Derek's partner for 3 years and change. 4 years old, 72 pounds of coiled nerve and quiet loyalty. A dog who had never once given a false alert on a scent in the field. Derek had learned to read him the way another man might read a wife, the tilt of an ear, the pace of a breath, the way the tail went still, dead still before a hit. The 2 of them had built the kind of trust that could not be taught in any handler course. Derek trusted Ranger's nose more than he trusted his own eyes on most days, and on the days he did not trust his own eyes, he trusted Ranger's nose more than he trusted anyone else in the department. That was the reason he did not hesitate when Ranger stiffened at the side entrance of the tent. Derek clipped the lead short and let the dog take him. He murmured an apology to the wedding coordinator, a small woman in a beige suit, whose face went the color of a paper plate the moment she saw the uniform. He said he would be quick. He was not going to be quick. Ranger moved through the tent like he was reading a map only he could see. He passed the gift table without a glance. He passed the champagne bar. He passed the arrangements of white roses and the folded seating chart on its easel. He walked straight through the middle aisle between the folding chairs while the string quartet stumbled and then stopped, and every head in that tent turned to watch. He walked all the way to the dessert table at the back and sat down. The cake was beautiful. 5 tiers, buttercream white as new snow, hand-piped ribbons, sprays of fresh gardenias tucked between the layers. The baker had delivered it that morning in a refrigerated van with the words Sweet Providence Bakery painted on the side in loopy blue script. Nicole had cried the first time she saw the sample tier. She had said it looked like something out of a dream. Now a working canine dog was sitting in front of it with his nose 2 inches from the second layer and his shoulders locked. And Derek Holt was reaching for his radio without taking his eyes off his partner. Nicole did not move. Nobody moved. Her father, Ray, still had her arm hooked in the crook of his elbow, and Derek could see the man's grip go tight, the way a father's grip goes tight when something in the world is about to hurt his child. Nicole herself had a look on her face Derek would remember for years afterward. Not fear, not confusion, something colder and slower. The look of a woman waiting for a picture to finish coming into focus. Travis Porter got there before the second officer did. He crossed the grass in that rented tuxedo with the pale blue tie Nicole had picked because it matched his eyes, and his face had gone the color of the tablecloth. He tried a smile. Derek had seen 100 men try that smile on the side of a highway with a taillight out, and he knew exactly what it meant. Travis said there had to be a mistake. He said it quietly, standing very close, the way a man says something when he wants to keep it out of the microphone. He said it was his wedding day. He said Nicole had been planning this for more than a year. He said if Derek could just give him 1 minute, 1 single minute alone with the officer, they could figure this out without ruining the ceremony. Derek looked at Ranger. Ranger had not moved. The dog's tail had not so much as twitched. Ranger was as certain about that cake as he had ever been about anything in his life. Derek said no. He said it quietly too, because he did not want to make a scene any bigger than the one already unfolding. He asked Travis to step back from the table. He asked him to keep his hands where they could be seen. He watched Travis's throat work as he swallowed. He watched the man's eyes flick once, very fast, toward Nicole, and then away. Derek had been on the job long enough to know exactly what that look was. That was a man saying goodbye. The second cruiser rolled onto the gravel 3 minutes later, and Sergeant Bill Trask stepped out with a look on his face that suggested he had already been briefed and was not enjoying the call. Trask was a heavy man with graying hair and the kind of gentle voice that had talked more people out of bad decisions than any weapon on his belt. He came into the tent apologizing to nobody in particular, took one look at Ranger's posture, and reached for the pair of blue latex gloves in his back pocket without a word. Nicole finally moved. She let go of her father's arm. Ray Briggs made a soft, protesting sound in his throat and reached for her, but she stepped clear of him. She walked down the aisle in the middle of her own ceremony, past the rows of frozen guests, past the wedding photographer who did not know whether to keep filming or put the camera down. She stopped 10 feet from the dessert table. She was still holding her bouquet, a loose cascade of white roses and lily of the valley that her mother had chosen because the lily of the valley was in season, and it smelled the way her grandmother's yard used to smell in June. She looked at Travis. She said his name once. That was all. Trask lifted the top tier of the cake with the careful hands of a man who had done this kind of thing more than once, and set it aside on a linen-covered tray. He lifted the second tier. He turned it over slowly, and the base of the tier came away in his fingers like a hidden lid. The inside of that second tier was hollow. A rectangular block of white foam had been fitted inside, carved out to hold 4 sealed plastic bags of a fine tan powder that looked, at first glance, like brown sugar. Trask did not touch the bags. He did not need to. Anybody who had worked patrol in Montgomery County in the last 3 years could tell fentanyl from cane sugar without a field kit, and Trask had worked patrol in Montgomery County for 22 years. He looked up at Derek. He said, quietly, that they were going to need the whole property shut down. He said it in the voice he used to break bad news to families, and Derek understood then, in a way he had not quite understood a minute earlier, exactly how big this was going to get. Nicole was still standing there with the bouquet. She had not looked inside the cake. She was watching Travis's face instead, and Travis was watching hers. And the whole tent had that suspended air quality of a room in which something has just broken and nobody yet knows how to admit it. Derek stepped between them. He asked Travis Porter, in the flat professional voice he used for arrests, to come with him. He read him his rights right there on the grass, under the white-peaked roof of the tent, with the string quartet's music stand still standing empty at the front, and the guests staring like a congregation that had forgotten the words to a prayer. Travis went. He did not resist. He did not ask for a lawyer, not yet. He did not look back at his bride until Derek had walked him past the last row of chairs, and then he did. And Nicole did not look back at him. She was watching Ranger instead. The dog had gotten up finally, at Derek's quiet command, and had come to sit at her heel without being asked. Nicole reached down and put one gloved hand on top of the Malinois's head. She stood like that for a long moment. The bouquet trembled in her other hand. Then she straightened up, handed the flowers to her maid of honor, Kelsey Hardin, without a word, and walked back up the aisle toward the small canvas bridal tent where she had spent the morning laughing with her sisters over champagne. She did not come out of that tent again for almost an hour. By the time she did, Sergeant Trask had cleared every guest off the property and taken the property manager's list of names, and 2 more county cruisers had blocked the service road. The white-peaked tent looked strange in the empty field, half set up, folding chairs turned at all the wrong angles. The arch at the front still hung with ribbons of white ivy. Derek's cruiser was parked at the edge of the grass, with Travis in the back seat. Ranger was in the front passenger seat now, because Derek had needed him close and calm, and the dog was watching the tent door with a stillness that felt almost human. Nicole walked out in jeans and a soft grey sweater. She had washed off the makeup. Her hair was still pinned up the way the stylist had done it that morning, but a few pieces had fallen loose around her face. She walked over to Derek and asked very quietly if she could sit down. He nodded and gestured to the front bumper of the cruiser. She sat. She rested her forearms on her knees. She looked at the grass for a long time. Then she asked Derek if the man in the back seat had known. Derek did not answer right away. He was not supposed to answer. He was supposed to say that any statements Mr. Porter had made were part of an active investigation. But he was also a man who had walked more than one woman through the worst afternoon of her life, and he knew that the truth, plainly given, sometimes did more good than any procedure ever had. He said the name Doug Farrell. Nicole did not react at first. She frowned. She turned the name over like a coin she did not recognize. Then something crossed her face very fast and she went very still. She said she had heard that name before. Derek did not push. He waited. She said Travis had mentioned it once, only once, back when they had first started dating, more than 3 years ago. She had asked about a scar on his forearm, a thin white line just under the bend of his wrist, and Travis had gone quiet and said it was from a bad time in his life. He had said he had borrowed money from a man named Doug when he was 22, when his mother had been sick and there had been no way to pay for the treatment she needed. He had said he had paid it back, all of it, and the man had cut his arm when he came to collect the last payment, just to make sure Travis remembered him. He had said it was a story from a version of his life she would never have to meet. Nicole had believed him. Nicole had held that scar between her fingers and told him that whoever he had been at 22, he was not that man anymore. She looked up at Derek. Her eyes were dry, but there was something in them that was worse than crying. She asked him to please tell her whether Doug Farrell was a name Travis had known about this morning. She said she needed to know that. She said she could deal with the rest, all of it, if she just knew that. Derek said yes. That was when Nicole finally let go. Not tears. She did not cry. She just closed her eyes and held onto the edge of the bumper with both hands, as if the ground had tilted underneath her, and she stayed like that for a very long minute. Then she opened her eyes and stood up and walked over to the back window of the cruiser and looked at Travis Porter through the tinted glass. He looked back at her. He mouthed her name. She turned and walked away without a word. Doug Farrell was picked up that night about 60 miles east on Interstate 70 in a black Chevrolet Tahoe that had been reported by a state trooper for a broken plate light. The trooper had recognized the vehicle from an all-points bulletin that had gone out at 7 that evening. Farrell was in the passenger seat. The driver was a young man named Cesar Delgado who claimed he had been paid $300 to drive to Columbus and did not know his passenger's name. Farrell said nothing at all. He asked for his lawyer at the roadside and did not open his mouth again for 11 days. Detective Marla Bennett caught the case Sunday morning at 7:15. She was a compact woman in her late 40s, with a soft voice and the sort of patience that made suspects underestimate her, which was exactly the way she liked it. She had been working narcotics in Montgomery County for 11 years. She had heard the name Doug Farrell more times than she cared to count. She had never gotten close to putting him in a cell, and she had been carrying that name in a small, angry corner of her mind for the better part of a decade. She interviewed Travis Porter Sunday afternoon. Travis had spent the night in the county lockup in his rented tuxedo pants and a paper jumpsuit shirt, and he had not slept. He was already talking to a public defender named Jerry Winkler. But the second Bennett walked into the room, Travis leaned forward and said he wanted to help. He said he wanted to be clear about that. He said he did not want any part of Doug Farrell, and he did not want a plea. He wanted the truth on the record, and he wanted to sleep at night for the first time in 9 months, and if that meant prison, then it meant prison. Bennett let him talk. Travis had not lied to Nicole about the scar. Not exactly. He had borrowed money from Farrell 9 years ago when he had been a broke 22-year-old whose mother had been dying of a kidney disease that the family's insurance had not been willing to pay for. He had needed $8,000 for a course of treatments, and he had needed it in cash, and he had needed it inside of a week. And Farrell had been the only person in Dayton who would loan a kid that kind of money without paperwork. Travis had paid it back over 18 months, in envelopes handed to a man named Reggie in the parking lot behind a shuttered bowling alley on Wayne Avenue. He had paid every dollar, and Farrell had cut his arm the day of the last payment, and had told Travis to remember him because the debt was never really over. Farrell had said that once he took a man's blood, the man belonged to him for good, and Travis had walked home that night with his sleeve wrapped in a shop rag, and he had told himself he would never hear the name Doug Farrell again. He had not until 9 months before the wedding. Farrell had come back into Travis's life through a phone call. Travis had been working as an assistant manager at a hardware store on the East Side. He had been 6 months into planning the biggest day of his life with the woman he was going to marry. The call had come from a number he did not recognize on a Tuesday evening in November while he was making chili in Nicole's apartment. Farrell's voice had come through as if the last 9 years had never happened. He had asked how Travis was doing. He had asked about the wedding. He had asked, and this had been the part that had frozen Travis where he stood over the stove, whether the venue was still Millbrook Farm out on Route 48. Travis had asked how Farrell knew about Nicole. Farrell had laughed and said that Travis had been very easy to keep an eye on. He had said he needed a favor. He had said Travis was going to help him move something on his wedding day. He had said the something was a cake. He had said the cake would be prepared by a baker Farrell had a working arrangement with, a man named Curtis Vaughn out of Kettering, who ran a small storefront called Sweet Providence Bakery, and that all Travis needed to do was make sure that Curtis Vaughn was the baker on the wedding contract. Nothing else. Farrell had said Travis's part in the whole thing was very small. He had said afterward Travis would never hear his name again. Travis had said no. He had said it, and he had meant it, and he had gone into the bathroom of Nicole's apartment and thrown up in the sink. He had come out and told Nicole he had a stomach bug and needed to go home. He had driven back to his own apartment and sat on the edge of his bed for an hour with his hands over his face. Then he had done the thing that had cost him everything. He had not called the police. He had told himself he could handle it. He had told himself that if he just refused, if he just kept refusing, Farrell would go find some other sucker with a wedding cake in his future. He had told himself Nicole would never have to know. He had told himself that a woman like Nicole should not have to carry a story like Doug Farrell inside a marriage. He had told himself a lot of things, and none of them had turned out to be true. He had signed the contract with Sweet Providence Bakery 2 days later. He had told himself he would find a way to switch bakers closer to the wedding date, and when he had not switched bakers, he had told himself it did not matter, that Farrell would not really do it, that Farrell had been bluffing to see how afraid Travis still was of him. Then on the morning of the wedding at 6:15, Farrell had called him one more time. Farrell had said the cake would arrive at 10. He had said the second tier was his tier. He had said not to touch it. He had said a driver would come by after the reception to collect it, and Travis had to make sure it was still on the dessert table at 9 that evening, uncut, with the second tier intact. He had said if anything happened to that tier, if the police found it, if Nicole's cousin poked her finger through the wrong side of it, Farrell would consider Travis's debt still outstanding. Then Farrell had said Nicole's name. He had said it in a way that had made Travis's blood stop moving. He had said that a beautiful bride like Nicole would look terrible in a hospital gown. He had said Travis should think about that while he was up there at the altar. Travis had gotten dressed. Travis had gone to the venue. Travis had smiled at his own bride while she stood in her mother's kitchen having her hair pinned up. Travis had told himself the same lie he had been telling himself for 9 months, which was that everything was going to be fine. Then a K9 officer no one had invited had walked into the tent, and everything had stopped being fine forever. Detective Bennett listened to all of it in a small, windowless room in the county lockup on Sunday afternoon. She did not interrupt. She did not react. When Travis was finally done, when his voice had gone raw and the paper cup of water in his hand was empty, she asked him one question. She asked whether he had ever, in the 9 months between that first call from Farrell and the wedding, considered telling Nicole. Travis said yes. He said he had thought about it every single day. He said he had rehearsed the speech in his head 100 times. He said the words had been on his lips more nights than he could count. He said in the end he had been too ashamed. He said he had told himself he was protecting her. Bennett looked at him for a long moment. She said quietly that a person who really wanted to protect someone did not lie to them about the size of the danger they were walking into. Travis started crying then. He put his face in his hands and cried in the way that men cry when a lifetime of held-in grief finally comes loose. Bennett let him. She was a good detective, and she knew when a suspect was performing and when a suspect had just reached the bottom of himself. And this was the second one. She left the interview room and stood in the hallway and rubbed her temples. She had a bad feeling that Travis Porter had not been the only person Doug Farrell had reached out to in the last 9 months. Farrell did not run an operation on the shoulders of one scared assistant manager at a hardware store. There was a bigger web, and it was somewhere in the wedding, and Bennett was going to find every strand of it, whether she slept or not. She called Officer Derek Holt that evening and asked him to bring Ranger in the next morning. Nicole spent Sunday at her mother's house on Ridgeway Drive. She did not talk about the wedding. She did not talk about Travis. She did not talk about the officer or the dog or the cake or the field or the guests. Her mother, Diane, who had learned in 58 years of living that there were certain silences a daughter had to be allowed to sit inside, made her a bowl of tomato soup at noon and put a grilled cheese sandwich in front of her at 1 and let her leave both untouched until 3, when Nicole finally ate the sandwich in 6 neat bites and put the bowl in the sink. Nicole's father, Ray, had gone back to Millbrook Farm that morning to collect a few personal items that had been left behind in the chaos. When he came home in the late afternoon, he came in carrying a small cardboard box, and he set it on the kitchen counter without meeting his wife's eyes. He looked, Nicole thought, older than he had looked the day before. Ray Briggs was 62. He had run an independent hardware distribution business for 31 years out of a warehouse in Moraine. He was a soft-voiced man who wore corduroy work jackets even in summer and who had, since Nicole was a little girl, been the person in her life she could count on to tell her the truth when nobody else would. Nicole loved her mother, but she trusted her father, and there was a difference she had known since childhood. That evening, after her mother had gone upstairs to run a bath, Nicole sat down at the kitchen table across from her father and asked him if he had known. Ray closed his eyes. He put both hands flat on the table. He said no. He said no, in the voice of a man who was telling the truth, and Nicole heard it and believed him, and then Ray said something else that broke her heart for the second time in 24 hours. He said he had suspected something. He said Travis had been quiet the last few weeks. He said Travis had not been sleeping. He said Travis had shown up at the warehouse on a Wednesday 2 weeks ago and had asked Ray whether he had ever done something he was ashamed of and could not undo. And Ray had told him that every man over 40 had done at least one thing on that list, and Travis had thanked him and left without saying anything else. Ray said he had gone home that evening and had thought about calling Nicole, and he had not, because he had told himself that Travis was just a nervous groom. Ray put his forehead down on the table. He said he was sorry. He said it over and over. Nicole reached across the table and put her hand on the back of her father's neck. She held it there. She did not say she forgave him, because she did not know yet whether she did. She did not say it was fine, because it was not. She just held on to him for a long time, until his shoulders stopped shaking. Then she asked him whether he had any idea who might have called in the anonymous tip. Ray lifted his head. He wiped his face on his sleeve. He said no. He said the whole department was assuming it was a rival of Farrell's or a business associate who had wanted to burn him. He said he could not think of anyone at the wedding who would have known enough to make that call. Nicole nodded. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that the tip had come at exactly the right time to spare her from marrying a man who had been lying to her for 9 months, and that she had spent enough time in the world to know that coincidences that convenient usually had a name attached to them. She went to bed in her old bedroom that night. Her mother had kept it exactly the way it had looked when Nicole had moved out for college 15 years ago, and Nicole had always found that a little embarrassing until that Sunday night, when the sight of the same white iron bed frame and the same faded quilt her grandmother had made when she was 9 turned out to be the only thing in the world that let her sleep. She dreamed of the dog, Ranger's dark eyes, the way he had come to sit at her heel without being asked, the way he had leaned very slightly into her leg when she had put her hand on his head. She dreamed of that leaning, and she woke up before dawn with tears on her face and the sudden certain knowledge that she was going to be all right, eventually someday, in a way she did not need to understand yet. She got up at 4:30 and made coffee in her mother's kitchen and watched the sun come up over the back fence. By 8 the next morning, Detective Bennett was standing in Kelsey Harden's kitchen in Beaver Creek with a small notebook in her hand. Kelsey was Nicole's best friend from college. They had roomed together for 3 years at Bowling Green and had stood up in each other's imaginary weddings a dozen times over glasses of cheap Chardonnay. Kelsey had been the maid of honor at Nicole's actual wedding, or would have been if the wedding had happened. She was a tall, dark-haired woman with a wide mouth and a quick laugh, and she'd spent Sunday night crying into her boyfriend's shoulder over Nicole, and she had not slept much either. Bennett sat down at Kelsey's small kitchen table and asked her a series of soft, methodical questions. Where had she been the morning of the wedding? Who had she spoken to? Had she noticed anything unusual about Travis's behavior in the last few weeks? Had Travis said anything to her that had struck her as strange? Kelsey answered all of them. She was honest and articulate and helpful and shaken, and Bennett had been in the interview business long enough to know that honest, articulate, helpful and shaken did not exclude other things. Then Bennett asked whether Kelsey had made the anonymous call to dispatch. Kelsey did not answer right away. Her hand tightened around her coffee cup. Her eyes went to the window. She was silent for a long time. Then she said yes. Bennett did not react. She did not shift in her chair. She just wrote a small note on her pad and waited. Kelsey told her the story then, in a voice that got smaller as she went. She said Travis had come to see her 3 weeks before the wedding. He had shown up at her office in downtown Dayton at the accounting firm where she worked, and he had asked if she had a minute. They had gone out to a coffee shop on the corner. He had asked her very carefully whether she thought Nicole would ever forgive a man who had hidden something bad from her because he had been trying to protect her. Kelsey had told him that depended entirely on what the bad thing was and who was ultimately in more danger because of the hiding. Travis had gone very quiet. He had said Nicole was in more danger. He had said it out loud, like he had been holding it inside for a long time. Then he had shaken his head and said he was being dramatic and had asked Kelsey not to mention the conversation to anyone. Kelsey had gone home that night and had not slept. She had gone home the next night and had not slept. She had gone home the third night and had called her older brother, who was a Cincinnati police detective, and had asked him, hypothetically, what he would do if he thought his sister's fiancé was involved in something dangerous, but he could not prove anything. Her brother had told her, hypothetically, to trust her gut and to call it in anonymously if she could not sit with the not knowing. Kelsey had made the call from a burner phone she had bought at a convenience store on the morning of the wedding. She said it was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. She said she had done it because she loved Nicole, because she could not bear the idea that in 14 months or 2 years or 5 years, a phone would ring in the middle of the night with news that her best friend had died in some way that Kelsey had had the chance to prevent. She said she had not known what would happen. She had not known if the tip would be taken seriously. She had not known if she had been wrong about Travis. She had not known any of it. She had only known that she could not stand in that white tent and hold a bouquet and smile, while something in her gut kept whispering that Nicole should not be walking down that aisle. She started to cry. She said she was going to lose her best friend over this. She said she knew that. She said she was going to tell Nicole when Nicole was ready to hear it. And if Nicole never spoke to her again after that, she was going to accept it. Bennett let her cry for a minute. Then she told Kelsey very gently that if it had not been for that anonymous call, 4 bags of fentanyl would have left Millbrook Farm that night and gone into somebody's neighborhood, and some number of people would have died in the following weeks who did not have to die, and that whatever Nicole did or did not say to her later, the world was better because Kelsey Harden had bought a burner phone. Kelsey nodded without lifting her face. Bennett stood up and thanked her for her time. She sat in her car outside Kelsey's apartment building for 10 minutes before she turned the key. She had a feeling that had been building all morning, and it was not a good feeling. Farrell had not chosen Travis at random. Farrell had not chosen Millbrook Farm at random. Farrell had known too much. He had known about the scar, and the mother and the debt and the wedding and Nicole, and the baker and the tent and the roads in and out of the property. That was not the profile of a man who had picked a target off a bulletin board. That was the profile of a man who had been sitting inside the wedding somehow from the beginning. Bennett called Derek Holt again that afternoon. She asked him to bring Ranger to the K9 unit at 4 the next morning, before the sun was up. She asked him to bring a jacket of Travis Porter's from evidence. She had an idea, and it was the kind of idea that she wanted to try in the quiet dark before she told anyone else about it. Derek said yes, without asking questions. The next morning at 5:15, in the grey light before dawn, Bennett and Derek Holt let Ranger sniff the shoulder of Travis's rented tuxedo jacket in the parking lot behind the property manager's office at Millbrook Farm. Then they walked him through the field where the tent had stood 2 days earlier. The canvas was gone, the chairs were gone, the dessert table was gone. Only the crushed grass in the shape of the aisle remained. Ranger walked the perimeter. He was not tracking Travis anymore because Bennett had cued him to something different with a soft command Derek had taught him back in his first year on the job. She had cued him for one specific compound that came off the residue of fentanyl handling, the way another dog might be cued for gunpowder or explosives. She wanted to know where else in that field the drug had been. Ranger circled the perimeter twice. He stopped once at the caterer's staging area. He stopped once at the corner where a small cluster of trees had provided shade for the bar. And then he walked over to the far edge of the property, past the crooked apple tree Nicole had loved, and sat down beside a small wooden storage shed that had been used by the venue's landscaping crew. Derek looked at Bennett. Bennett looked at the shed. She got a warrant by noon. They opened the shed at 1:30. What they found inside was more than she had bargained for. 2 cardboard boxes wrapped in landscape fabric sealed with silver duct tape, containing a total of 12 additional bags of fentanyl and about $400,000 in banded cash. The boxes had been sitting in that shed for at least a week, judging by the dust on top of the fabric and the state of the tape. Bennett stood in the doorway of that shed and understood, finally and completely, what the wedding had really been. The wedding had not been the delivery. The wedding had been the pickup. Farrell had used the venue as a temporary storage site because it was rural, low traffic, unwatched, and staffed by seasonal landscapers who came and went without anybody keeping track. The cake had been a decoy. The cake had been the piece Farrell had let Travis see, so that Travis would be too afraid and too ashamed to look at anything else. The real freight had already been sitting on the property for days. Someone at Millbrook Farm had known about that shed. Someone at Millbrook Farm had let Farrell use it. Bennett stood in that grey shed with the smell of fresh-cut grass in her nose and started to write down the names of every person on the venue's payroll. By that afternoon, she had a working theory, and the theory pointed at a man named Otis Red, the head of Millbrook Farm's landscaping crew, a 54-year-old with 2 grown children in Dayton and a gambling problem the venue's owner had not yet noticed. She sent 2 officers to pick up Otis at his mobile home in Trotwood. She sat in her office and waited. While she waited, she called Nicole. Nicole picked up on the 3rd ring. Her voice was hoarse. Bennett kept it short. She said she needed Nicole to come in for a formal statement the next morning. She said there had been developments. She did not tell Nicole about the shed. That was not for the phone. Nicole said yes. She said she would be there at 10. She was there at 9:45. Bennett walked her through the whole thing. The shed, the cash, Otis Red, who had confessed within 30 minutes of being sat down in a small, warm room. Bennett watched Nicole's face as she took it all in. She was watching for the moment where Nicole broke, because women in Nicole's position usually broke somewhere in the middle of the 2nd or 3rd bad thing. Nicole did not break. She sat very straight in the metal chair. She listened to every word. When Bennett was finished, she asked one question. She asked whether her father Ray had been anywhere near that shed in the last 2 weeks. Bennett had not expected that question. She said honestly that she did not know. She said Ray had not been on the venue's payroll, obviously, but she could check whether he had visited the property in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Nicole nodded. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was wearing a plain navy sweater and her father's old work watch, which was a men's watch too big for her wrist, and Bennett noted the watch and filed it away, because that was the kind of small detail a good detective did not throw away. Nicole said she needed Bennett to check. Bennett said she would. Then Nicole did something Bennett did not see coming. She said that when she had gone with her father 3 weeks before the wedding to walk the property one last time with the venue coordinator, her father had asked her to give him a minute at the far end of the field, near the shed. He had said he needed to take a call from a supplier. She had thought nothing of it at the time. She had walked back to the tent to look at the arch again. She had waited a good 15 minutes for him. She had not seen the phone in his hand when he came back. She said it now, the way a person says something they have been trying not to notice. Bennett looked at her for a long moment. She did not say anything. Neither did Nicole. That afternoon, Detective Bennett drove out to Ray Briggs's warehouse in Moraine. She parked in the visitor lot. She sat in her car for a full minute. Then she went in. Ray was in his office, a small glass-walled room at the back of the warehouse floor. He was on the phone when Bennett walked up, and he ended the call the moment he saw her uniform. His face went the same color Travis's face had gone in the tent. Bennett recognized that color now. She was going to see it a few more times in this case before she was done. She closed the door behind her. She sat down across from him. She said she was not there to arrest him. She said she just wanted to have a conversation. Ray Briggs put his head in his hands. He talked for almost 2 hours. Bennett let a tape recorder run the whole time, with his permission. She left the room only once to get him a bottle of water. When she came back, he had not moved. Ray had been in debt. Not the kind of debt that made the newspapers. The quiet kind. The kind that a small business owner carried for decades because his suppliers had gotten more expensive and his customers had gotten more careful and his margins had thinned to almost nothing. Ray had borrowed against his house 6 years ago. He had borrowed against the warehouse 3 years after that. He had juggled the payments the way a man juggles bad news he does not want to tell his wife. His wife did not know. Nicole did not know. Nobody knew. Doug Farrell had learned about it because Doug Farrell made a business out of learning about it. 2 months before the wedding, Farrell had come to the warehouse. He had walked in through the front door like he was buying a box of nails. He had sat down in the chair Bennett was sitting in now. He had put an envelope on Ray's desk. Inside the envelope had been a piece of paper showing Ray's exact debt, down to the dollar, and a photograph of Nicole coming out of a coffee shop on High Street, taken from across the road. Farrell had said he could make the debt go away. He had said all Ray had to do was let a landscaping crew use the storage shed at Millbrook Farm in the 2 weeks leading up to his daughter's wedding. He had said Ray had a relationship with the venue's owner because Ray had done the wiring on the barn renovation 3 years ago as a favor. Farrell had said Ray only needed to make one small call and the shed would be theirs for a week and a half. That was all. Farrell had said Ray's daughter's wedding would go forward without a hitch. Ray had made the call. Bennett listened to that part of the confession without moving a muscle. She was watching a good man's life turn inside out on the surface of a metal desk, and she had learned a long time ago that there was no way to watch that gently. There was only bearing witness. Ray said he had told himself the same lies Travis had told himself. He had told himself Nicole would never have to know. He had told himself the shed was just a shed, and whatever was in it was not his problem. He had told himself that a father was supposed to protect his daughter, and if protecting his daughter meant looking the other way for a week and a half, then he would look the other way for a week and a half. He had not known about the cake. He had not known Travis. He had not known any of the rest. He said he had gone up to the barn that morning of the wedding, and had walked past the shed on his way to the coordinator's office, and he had stopped, and he had looked at the padlock, and he had thought about calling the police. He had thought about it for a full minute. He had walked into the coordinator's office instead, and had accepted a cup of coffee and a hug, and had told her the barn looked beautiful. Bennett asked him one question when he was done. She asked whether Ray Briggs was prepared to testify against Doug Farrell. Ray said yes without hesitating. Bennett stood up. She told him she was going to have to walk him out in cuffs for the officers at the desk, but that she was going to remove them the second they got to the interview room. She told him to call his wife from the car. She told him that if he told the truth and kept telling it, she was going to work very hard to make sure he did not go to prison. She told him nothing about his daughter because she did not know what his daughter was going to do next, and she did not think it was her place to guess. Nicole was at her mother's house when Ray called. She listened to her father cry into the phone. She said very little. She told him she loved him. She told him she was going to come and see him in the morning. She hung up. She walked out into her mother's back garden. She sat down on the concrete step by the tomato plants. She stayed out there for a long time. It was after dark by the time she went inside. Her mother had made dinner. Neither of them ate. Diane Briggs, who had raised Nicole and Nicole's older brother Jason on a school nurse salary and a hardware distributor's careful arithmetic, sat across from her daughter at that same kitchen table and asked what she needed. Nicole thought about it for a long time. She said she needed to know one thing. She said she needed to know how her mother, who had married Ray Briggs when both of them were 23, could keep loving a man who had done what her father had done. Diane thought about it. She said finally that loving a man did not mean approving of every choice he had ever made. She said it meant deciding, over and over, that the good in him was worth the cost of standing by him while he answered for the bad. She said Nicole did not have to make that decision the same way she did. She said Nicole did not have to make any decision at all yet. She said the only thing Nicole had to do right now was breathe and drink water and let herself be sad for as long as it took. Nicole cried then. It was the first time she had cried since Sunday morning. She cried for a long time. Her mother came around the table and held her while she did. They both went to bed after midnight. Bennett was back in her office by 7 the next morning. She had barely slept. She had a stack of interview transcripts on her desk that included Travis, Kelsey, Otis Red, Ray Briggs, the venue owner, 2 members of the landscaping crew, and a young waiter who had noticed something odd in the caterer's van the night before the wedding. She had a warrant out for Curtis Vaughan, the baker, who had left his Kettering storefront at 3 in the afternoon on Saturday and had not been seen since. She had Doug Farrell in a holding cell, still silent, with a lawyer named Marcus Rowe, whom she had crossed swords with 3 times before and whom she did not underestimate. She had a lot. She still did not have quite enough. She had a feeling, sitting at her desk in the early light, that there was still one piece of the story she had not turned over. Farrell had known too much. He had known about the scar and the mother and the wedding, and even that was reasonable if he had been running a light surveillance operation for years. But the timing of it, the choice of the venue, the precision of the pickup, that had needed inside knowledge, and inside knowledge did not usually come from Otis Red, who had confessed that he had never even met Farrell in person and had only been paid through the landscaping crew's cash-only side arrangement. Bennett was looking at her wall of note cards for the 5th time in an hour when Derek Holt walked in. He had Ranger with him. He said Ranger had had a rough night, that the dog had been unsettled since Sunday and had refused his kibble on Monday morning. He said he had brought him along in case they needed to run him through any evidence. Bennett looked at the dog. Ranger looked back at her. His ears were up. His eyes were dark and clear. Bennett had an idea. She pulled the sealed evidence bag containing the cell phones from the Millbrook farm case off the corner of her desk. There were 4 phones, Farrell's, Travis's, Otis Red's, and Curtis Vaughan's, which had been left inside the delivery van when the van had been found abandoned at a truck stop in Springfield the morning after the wedding. She asked Derek if Ranger could sniff Vaughan's phone. Derek looked at her strangely, but he opened the bag with a pair of gloves and set the phone on a paper towel on the desk. Ranger came over and put his nose to it. He did not sit. He did not alert. But he lingered. He lingered longer than he lingered on any of the other phones. Bennett watched him. She said, half to herself, that she wanted to try something. She asked Derek to leave the phone on the paper towel. She asked him to walk Ranger out into the hallway, then down to the front lobby of the station, and to the row of chairs where people came in to file reports. There was one man sitting in those chairs at that moment. He had been sitting there for about 10 minutes. He had walked in without an appointment and had asked to see Detective Bennett about a private matter and had told the desk officer he would wait. The desk officer had assumed he was a witness in one of Bennett's other open cases. The man was Wade Porter, Travis's older brother. Wade Porter had shown up at the funeral home a decade ago when Travis's mother had died, and had been the one to write the checks that had actually saved the family from bankruptcy after the treatments had failed. He had been a quiet man, 5 years older than Travis, an electrician by trade with his own contracting business in Springfield. He had lent Travis the money to buy Nicole's engagement ring. He had toasted them at the rehearsal dinner 2 nights before the wedding. He had told a joke about Travis in 7th grade that had made even the pastor laugh. Derek walked Ranger down the hallway. Ranger's nose was low, his head was up. He was working in the way that a good working dog works, when he is not sure yet what he is looking for, but is confident he will find it. He came out into the lobby. He walked past the desk. He walked past the water cooler. He walked past the row of chairs, where an elderly woman was filling out a lost property form. He stopped in front of Wade Porter and sat down. Wade looked at the dog. He looked at Derek. He looked at Detective Bennett, who had followed at a discreet distance and was standing in the doorway of the hall. He did not run. He did the opposite of running. He put his hands on his knees, and he sighed a very long sigh, and he said quietly that he had been trying to work out for 2 days how to walk into this building and tell them everything he knew, and he supposed the dog had just made the decision for him. Bennett took Wade Porter into an interview room and closed the door. Wade had been the connection. It had started, as most things in the case had started, with money. Wade had built his contracting business up from nothing in the years after his mother's death. He had done well. He had bought a small house. He had gotten married and then divorced. He had put himself in the middle of a small commercial development in Springfield that had gone bad in a way that had cost him almost everything he had built. He had needed a bridge loan. He had gone to a man he had heard about through another contractor, a man who did not ask a lot of questions, and that man had turned out to be Doug Farrell. Wade had borrowed $60,000. He had paid it back over 2 years. He had thought, like Travis had thought, that he was clear when the last envelope had left his hands. He had been wrong. Farrell had approached Wade 11 months before the wedding. He had said he needed a favor. He had said he needed access to somebody close to Travis because he had a piece of business he wanted Travis to help with, and he needed a way to keep Travis honest. He had said Wade was going to be that way. Wade had refused. He had refused, and then Farrell had shown him a photograph of Wade's 10-year-old daughter Hazel walking into her elementary school in Springfield. Hazel lived with Wade's ex-wife most of the year. Wade had not seen the photograph in his life. He had put both hands flat on the table where he was sitting, and he had asked Farrell what he wanted. Farrell had wanted the venue. Farrell had known Wade knew Millbrook Farm, because Wade had done some of the electrical work in the barn a few years back. He had known Wade was close to the venue's owner. He had asked Wade to make the introduction that would allow the landscaping crew to be paid a little extra to use the shed for a week and a half. He had also asked Wade for something else. He had asked Wade to be sure that Travis went through with the wedding, because Farrell had known, and this was the piece that made Bennett's stomach turn, that if Travis had ever been going to break, he was going to break in the last week. He was going to come apart and call it off. He was going to call the police. And so Farrell needed somebody near Travis to keep him from doing that. Somebody Travis trusted. Somebody Travis would listen to. Wade had spent the last 9 months of his brother's life talking him off ledges. He had done it while hating himself. He had done it while holding a photograph of his daughter in the top drawer of his desk. He had gone to the rehearsal dinner and had toasted his brother and his brother's bride. He had done all of it because he had believed wrongly that Farrell would keep his word and would call it done after the wedding. The night of the wedding, when Travis had been booked, Wade had gone home and had opened a bottle of bourbon and had sat in his kitchen until sunrise. He had come to the station that morning. He had waited in the lobby, and a dog he had never met had walked up to him and sat down in front of him, and Wade had understood in that moment that whatever came next, he was going to face it standing up. Bennett took his full statement. It took 4 hours. When it was over, Wade Porter asked quietly whether he could see his daughter that night before he was booked. Bennett said she would talk to the prosecutor. She said she would try. She did not make any promises. She never made promises. But she called the prosecutor herself an hour later, and by evening, Wade Porter was sitting in his ex-wife's living room in Springfield, with Hazel on his lap and his ex-wife in the doorway, with her arms crossed and a hard, still expression on her face that softened just a little, when Hazel put both her small arms around her father's neck and pressed her face into his shoulder. Wade turned himself in the next morning at 8. By that Wednesday morning, 3 days after the wedding that never was, Detective Marla Bennett had almost everything she needed. She had Travis, she had Wade, she had Ray, she had Otis Red, she had Kelsey Hardin's timely tip, she had the shed, she had the cash, she had the 4 bags in the cake and the 12 in the boxes, she had the phones, she had the baker's abandoned van. What she did not have still was Doug Farrell talking, and she did not have the baker himself. Curtis Vaughn was picked up on Thursday morning at a motel outside Louisville, Kentucky, by a state trooper who recognized his description from a bulletin. Vaughn was tired. He had spent 5 days on the run. He was also, it turned out, sick. He had a fever of 101.3 degrees when the trooper found him, and he was arraigned by video from a bed in the county infirmary. He talked immediately. He confirmed everything Travis and Wade had said. He added a few things they had not known. He told Bennett that Farrell had been running his operation for years out of a series of small, legitimate businesses, using events, especially weddings and funerals, as pick-up points, because those events happened on private property with limited security. Vaughn had baked cakes for 11 of them in the last 3 years. Nicole and Travis's cake had been number 12. Vaughn cried while he confessed. He said his own mother had had cancer, that Farrell had come to him 5 years ago with a piece of paper showing his mother's medical bills, and that he had baked his first false cake 3 weeks later. He said he had known, from the beginning, that this was going to end with him in a room like the one he was in. He said he was almost relieved. Farrell finally cracked on the following Monday, 8 days after the wedding, in the presence of his lawyer, Marcus Rowe. He did not confess to anything specific. He did not have to. His silence, once it broke, was not a confession so much as an offer. He proposed a deal. He gave the prosecutor a list of names, a list of shipment routes, a list of banks he had used to launder money over the last decade. He was not doing it out of remorse. He was doing it because he had learned from the deposition transcripts he had been permitted to read that his web had been more thoroughly mapped than he had believed possible, and that he had a better chance of dying in a medium-security prison in 10 years than in a maximum-security prison in 30. The prosecutor took the deal because the list Farrell handed over cut through 3 organizations in Western Ohio, and any prosecutor in the state would have taken it. Farrell was sentenced to 18 years. Travis Porter, in exchange for his cooperation and testimony, received 4 years. His public defender, Jerry Winkler, argued at sentencing that Travis had lived in fear of a violent man for nearly a decade and had made a series of bad choices while trying to protect the woman he loved. The judge, a soft-spoken older woman named Marjorie Aldridge, listened to that argument and to Travis's own statement, which he read in a shaking voice from a piece of yellow legal paper, and she agreed that Travis had done something serious and wrong and had done it out of shame rather than greed. And she gave him 4 years with the possibility of parole in 2.5. Wade Porter received 2 years and 18 months of probation. Ray Briggs received a suspended sentence and community service and lost his license to operate his warehouse for 5 years, which effectively ended his business. Otis Red received a year in county. Kelsey Hardin was never charged with anything because she had done nothing wrong except believe her friend was in danger and act on it, and every judge in the state understood the difference between that and a crime. Curtis Vaughn was sentenced to 5 years. Sweet Providence Bakery closed for good. The story ran in the Dayton Daily News for a week. National Wire Services picked it up. The photograph they used, more often than not, was one taken by an offshoot camera at the reception, showing Ranger sitting in front of the cake with his nose 2 inches from the second tier. The photograph became a kind of small, famous thing. A Belgian Malinois with dark eyes, staring at a 5-tier gardenia cake in a field on a summer afternoon. There was a picture book quality to it that the newspapers could not stop using. Ranger himself received a citation from the county sheriff. Derek Holt stood at attention beside him in the ceremony room at the courthouse, while the sheriff pinned a small brass medal to the leather of Ranger's working vest. Ranger did not appear impressed. He wagged his tail once, politely, when the sheriff bent down to speak to him. That was all. Nicole was in the room for the ceremony. Derek had asked her privately, a few weeks before, whether she would want to be there, and Nicole had said yes, without hesitating. She sat in the second row and clapped for the dog. Afterward, she walked up and put her hand on Ranger's head, the way she had put her hand on it in the field that afternoon, and Ranger leaned very slightly into her leg, the way he had leaned that first time, and Nicole smiled for the first time in weeks. She and Derek talked outside, on the courthouse steps in the September sun. Not for long, she thanked him. She thanked him without drama, in the way a private woman thanks somebody when the thanks matter, and she does not want to make a production of it. She said she was going back to using her maiden name. She said she was going to move to Cincinnati for a while and stay with her older brother Jason. She said she was going to be all right eventually, in a way she was still working out. Derek nodded. He asked if she was sure. Nicole said no, she was not sure of anything, but that she was going to keep moving anyway because that was the only way she had found so far that seemed to work. She left it at that. Nicole filed the paperwork to go back to her maiden name in November, alone, at the county clerk's office on a Tuesday morning. She had not brought her mother. She had not brought Kelsey. She had done it privately, because the whole thing had already been public in a way she did not want to feed. The clerk, an older woman with kind eyes named Frances, had looked at Nicole's face over the paperwork and had said very softly that she was very sorry for the trouble, and Nicole had thanked her and had signed the forms and had walked out into the parking lot in a grey coat with her hair in a low ponytail. She had driven to her mother's house for lunch. She had eaten her mother's tomato soup, which she had finally been able to eat again a few weeks earlier. She had not talked about the paperwork. She had not needed to. Kelsey Hardin came to see her a week later. Nicole opened the door and let her in and made her a cup of tea. They sat at Nicole's mother's kitchen table for 2 hours. Nicole did not shout. She did not cry. She told Kelsey she had spent months trying to work out whether she was angry at her and whether she was going to be able to stop being angry, and she had decided finally that she was not angry. She was grateful. She was grateful in the deep, hard, painful way a person is grateful for something that saved her life at a cost she did not know how to repay. Kelsey started to cry. Nicole did not cry. She reached across the table and took her friend's hand and said, very quietly, that she loved her, and that she would love her again, and that they were going to get their friendship back, the same way people got everything back after this kind of thing, which was slowly, and by choosing it and by being patient with each other. They stayed on the phone every night for a month after that. It was not what either of them had had before the wedding. It was something different, and Nicole came to think over the winter that it might in some ways be something better. Ray Briggs served his community service at a Goodwill warehouse on the south side of Dayton. He worked 8-hour days, sorting donated furniture. He came home tired and did not complain. He and Diane sold their house in the summer and moved into a smaller one on Norwood Avenue with a good back garden and a mortgage they could afford. Ray never went back into business. He got a part-time job at a hardware store on Wayne Avenue, one town over from the parking lot where Travis had once dropped envelopes for Doug Farrell, and he worked there 4 days a week, and stopped worrying about anything more complicated than whether he had the right size of finishing nails in the 7/8 bin. He and Nicole had a long talk on Thanksgiving. She'd come home for the weekend. He had made her coffee. They had sat on the back step in the November cold with their coats on. He had said everything he had already said, which was that he was sorry. And Nicole had said everything she had already said, which was that she loved him. Then Ray had said one more thing. He had said he understood if she never wanted to introduce him to her children, if she had children. Nicole had thought about that for a minute. She had said she was not going to promise him what she would do about that in 10 years. She had said she would try, and that trying was the best either of them was going to get, and that trying was probably enough. Ray had nodded. He had gotten up. He had gone inside to help Diane with the pie. Travis Porter went to a medium security facility outside Chillicothe. Nicole did not visit him. She did not write to him. She did not respond to the 2 letters he sent her in the first 6 months. She had made her decision on the grass at Millbrook Farm at the moment she had turned and walked back to the bridal tent, and she was not going to unmake it. She did not hate him. She did not think about him with any heat. She had come, in the year after the wedding, to think of him the way a person thinks of a house they used to live in. Somebody else lived there now. It was not her house anymore. Travis served his time. He came out on parole in the summer, just under 3 years after the wedding. He moved to Cleveland to live with an aunt. He worked in a lumber yard. He did not try to contact Nicole again after the second letter went unanswered, because he had learned from the counselor he had seen weekly in prison that respecting a person's silence was a form of respecting the person, and that he owed Nicole at least that much, and probably a great deal more. Nicole heard from her brother Jason, who kept in loose touch with Wade Porter, that Travis was doing all right. She was glad to hear it. It surprised her that she was glad to hear it. She thought about that for a while, and then she stopped thinking about it, because there were more important things she wanted to think about. One of them was the dog. She'd been thinking about Ranger, off and on, for a year. She had thought about him in Cincinnati, where she had moved in with her brother Jason and his wife and their 2-year-old for 6 months while she got back on her feet. She had thought about him when she had found her first apartment on her own in a neighborhood called Northside, in a small 1-bedroom above a coffee shop. She had thought about him on the mornings she woke up early and could not go back to sleep. She had thought about the way he had leaned into her leg in the field. She had thought about the way he had looked at her in the courtroom on the day of his citation. She had thought more than once that she had felt something in that moment that she had not felt in a lot of years, which was the sensation of being seen exactly for what she was. That was what led her eventually back to Millbrook Farm. It was a Saturday in June, 1 year after the wedding. Nicole had driven up from Cincinnati that morning in an old Honda Civic she had bought after selling the little Toyota she had shared with Travis. She had told nobody where she was going. She had a small canvas bag on the passenger seat with a sweater and a bottle of water and a paperback book she was almost done with. She had also called Derek Holt. She had called him a week earlier. She had explained who she was and had said that she had a strange request. She had said she wanted to walk the field. She had said she did not know why she wanted to. She had said she just did. She had asked whether it would be possible for him and Ranger to meet her out there. She had said if he thought it was a weird ask, she would understand. Derek had said it was not a weird ask. He had said he would be there. The 2 of them met at the gate of Millbrook Farm at 10 in the morning. Derek was in civilian clothes, a green work jacket and jeans and heavy boots. Ranger was off duty, which meant no vest and no lead, just a soft collar with a small silver tag that jingled when he walked. He came out of the passenger side of Derek's pickup and stretched, the long backward arching stretch of a big dog who had been sitting still for an hour. Then he came over to Nicole and sat down at her feet without being asked, and Nicole felt her breath catch and let it out slowly. She said hello to him. The 3 of them walked across the grass. The apple tree was still there. The swing was still there. The barn had been repainted. There was no white tent. There were no chairs. It was just a field again. Fields have a way of forgetting. Nicole had not been sure whether that would make coming back easier or harder, and it turned out it made it easier in ways she had not been able to predict. They walked all the way to the far end where the shed had been. The shed had been torn down. There was a small vegetable garden there now, planted by the venue's owners, tomatoes and basil and peppers on stakes. Nicole stood at the edge of the garden and looked at it for a long time. Ranger sat next to her the whole while, patient in the way he was always patient. Derek did not talk. He was not a man who felt the need to fill quiet, and Nicole appreciated that about him more than she could have said. They walked back toward the barn. Nicole stopped once, in the middle of the field, in the exact place where she remembered standing on that afternoon a year earlier, and she stood there for a minute, with the wind moving in the grass around her boots. She thought about a woman named Nicole who had stood in that spot in an ivory dress. She thought about how far she had walked since then. She reached down and put her hand on top of Ranger's head. Ranger leaned very slightly into her leg. Nicole laughed. It surprised her. It surprised Derek. It came up out of her without any warning, a small clear laugh at the middle of a green field on a summer morning, and it broke something inside her chest that she had been carrying around like a weight without knowing she was carrying it. She wiped her eyes. She said she was ready to go. They walked back to the cars. Derek asked if she wanted to grab a cup of coffee at the diner on the way back to the highway. Nicole thought about it. She said yes. They drove separately down Route 48, and they sat across from each other in a booth at a place called Rita's, and they ordered coffee and blueberry pancakes, and Ranger lay down under the table with his chin on Nicole's boot. They talked for 2 hours. They did not talk about the wedding. They did not talk about Travis or Pharrell or the cake or the shed. They talked about their childhoods. Derek had grown up in a town called Vandalia, 10 minutes north. His father had been a machinist. Derek had wanted to be a veterinarian for most of his early life, before he had drifted into police work through a summer job. Nicole had grown up in Dayton. Her mother had been a school nurse. She had wanted to be an architect for most of her early life, before she had drifted into event planning. They laughed at the small, similar shapes their lives had, and at the way people ended up in professions almost by accident. Derek said Ranger was going to retire in a year. He said Belgian Malinois canines usually retired around 6 or 7, and Ranger was 5 and change, and the department had a policy that let handlers adopt their partners at retirement. He said Ranger was going to spend his retirement in Derek's backyard with a piece of rope and a stuffed rabbit, and probably a great deal of leftover chicken. Nicole smiled. She said that sounded like a good retirement. Derek said it sounded like a good retirement to him too. They paid separately at the counter. They stood by the cars in the small gravel lot. Nicole thanked him for coming out. Derek said quietly that he was glad she had asked. He said he had been thinking about the case and about her for the whole year, and that he had wondered from time to time whether she was doing all right. He said seeing her that morning had answered his question and had made him glad. Nicole thanked him for that too. She thought about it, and then she asked him whether he would want to have coffee again sometime. She said she was not asking anything more than that. She said she was still figuring out what she wanted and what she did not want, and she did not have any answers about the rest of her life. She just knew, she said, that she had liked the pancakes. Derek smiled. It was a slow, careful smile. He said he had liked the pancakes too. He said he had no answers about the rest of his life either. He said he would like to have coffee again sometime, whenever she wanted. No expectations, no plans, no promises. Nicole nodded. She reached down one more time and put her hand on Ranger's head. Ranger looked up at her with those dark, still eyes. He wagged his tail once, exactly once, which was not much for another dog, but which was, from Ranger, a whole speech. She got into her car. She drove back to Cincinnati with the windows down and the June air in her hair. That evening, back in her small apartment above the coffee shop, she sat down at her kitchen table with the paperback book she had been almost done with. She finished the last 30 pages. She closed the book. She sat there for a while, listening to the sound of the coffee shop closing up downstairs, and she thought about her life. She thought about the picture of herself in an ivory dress in a field. She thought about the picture of herself the moment she had turned and walked back to the bridal tent. She thought about the picture of herself signing a form at the clerk's office in November. She thought about the picture of herself standing in a green field with her hand on the head of a dog. She thought about how much a life could change in a year. She thought about how much of the change had come from a stranger's dog putting his nose 2 inches from a wedding cake and refusing to move. She thought about how sometimes what looked, at first, like the worst afternoon of your life turned out to be the afternoon somebody saved you from a much longer disaster you had been walking into with your eyes closed. She thought finally about Kelsey Hardin, who had bought a burner phone at a convenience store because she had trusted her gut. About Ray Briggs, who had been a good man who had made a bad choice and who was now, slowly and painfully, making better ones. About Diane Briggs, who had held her while she cried at a kitchen table. About Derek Holt, who had not needed her to have any of it figured out. About Ranger, who had not needed her to have any of it figured out either. She thought about the fact that she was going to be all right. She thought about the fact that she already was. Outside her window, the summer light was going soft over the neighborhood. Somebody down on the sidewalk was playing a guitar. She could hear it faintly through the glass. She got up and made herself a cup of tea and stood at the window with the mug in both hands and listened for a long time. If you have felt something in this story, if any part of it reminded you of somebody you know, or of a corner of your own life you have not looked at in a while, take a moment to comment down below and tell me what stayed with you. Give this video a like if a working dog and a friend who trusted her gut just quietly saved somebody's life, and hit that subscribe button so more stories like this one come and find you. Take care of the people who love you enough to make the hard call. Take care of yourselves, and never underestimate what a good dog can smell on a summer afternoon.